is going to cover a possible reincarnation story. I find the concept of reincarnation to be extremely fascinating and intriguing. It seems to be one of those ideas that has been around for millennia. It's ancient in origin, and it seems to be very widespread throughout different cultures, different spiritual belief systems. Almost all of them have some kind of reference to the soul and living again, and I just find it super fascinating, as I think a lot of us do, because humans are pretty obsessed with life and death and what happens after death, if anything does happen. And there are many, many stories, especially from children, where they seem to recall memories of a life that they had before this one. And this story I'm going to share today is one of the most convincing stories that I've ever heard. So today's story is about a boy named James Leininger. I'm not sure if you pronounce it Leininger or Leininger. It's Leininger. Not too sure. But he was born on April 10th, 1998, to parents Bruce and Andrea. And in the year 2000, when James was just 2 years old, he became obsessed with airplanes. Now, I know little boys loving cars and trains and planes and vehicles is very common, but this little boy honed in on airplanes in a really big way, like more than just your average kid enjoying vehicles. He was totally obsessed and wanted to learn as much about them as possible, and he was especially interested in warplanes. And his parents say that from an early age, James would play with nothing else but his airplanes and his G.I. Joe action figures, which we'll get to soon. They had pictures all over the house of airplanes because of James, but they also included aircraft carriers and helicopters as well. And Andrea said that one time they were both, her and James, looking at a picture together of a plane, and Andrea said to him, "Oh look, there's a bomb on the bottom of the plane," and James, at 2 years old, responded saying, "That's not a bomb, Mama, that's a drop tank." And Andrea was just like, I had never heard of a drop tank before. I didn't even know what one was. So she was stunned that her 2-year-old could tell her something like this. Andrea, Bruce, and James were soon due to move from Texas to Louisiana. But before they did move, Bruce wanted to take James to the Cavana Flight Museum in Addison, Texas. It might be pronounced Kavanaugh, not sure. But he wanted to take him there, obviously to show him all the planes, because he knew that his son would absolutely love it. So he took him, and Bruce said that he could not believe how mesmerized his son was at the museum, and he specifically was enamored by the World War II exhibit. He seemed to just want to stay in there all day. Eventually, Bruce tried to gently guide him out of the exhibit to go and explore elsewhere in the museum, but James would just wander straight back to the World War II exhibit. And after being at the exhibit for 3 hours, Bruce was like, "Okay, look, we need to go now, buddy." And James threw a tantrum. He got really upset. He was crying and kicking up a fuss and saying that he didn't want to leave. So, in order to try and calm his son down and get him to stop crying, Bruce bought him a videotape from the gift shop, which was of a Navy Blue Angels flight demonstration tape. And once they got home, James immediately put it on and started watching it, and this became his new obsession. He wanted this tape on all the time. So that's how into planes and World War II this child was. You know, not only does he play with them all the time, there are pictures everywhere in the house. He now has a video that he constantly wants playing in the background so he can watch and play at the same time. I think he would even draw pictures, mainly of airplanes. So he was really, really into them. And what makes this story even more intriguing is that his parents and his family members don't have any ties or background in aviation or the military. You would think that a child that becomes obsessed with aeroplanes in World War II would likely get an interest like that because of stories heard from a family member. But that wasn't happening at all. So his family had no idea where he got this obsession from or how he even knew so much about planes. Just 2 weeks after James's second birthday, towards the end of April in 2000, he started having really bad nightmares, like the type that you would consider to almost be a night terror, because he would scream and kick in his sleep, and when he woke up he would be extremely upset, and it would appear as if he was traumatized by his nightmares. And this became frequent. He was having these nightmares between 4 and 6 times a week, and his parents started to become very concerned about him. Andrea said that she'd wake him up and he'd be screaming whilst lying on his back and kicking his feet up at the ceiling, and she'd ask him, "Baby, what were you dreaming about?" And James would say, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." And this same nightmare kept recurring over and over and over again, of him being in a plane, it crashing, and then him burning inside the plane and he can't get out. Naturally, his parents are very alarmed by this, and they want to try and come up with an answer as to why he's having this specific dream that's really affecting their son. And this is when James's grandma, Andrea's mum, first mentions the idea of reincarnation. She suggested that maybe James is experiencing a past life memory and needed some help getting past it. So Andrea took her mum's advice and started to ask James more about the dreams he was having. But her husband Bruce was really, really skeptical about this. He was a devout Christian and just completely dismissed the idea of reincarnation. He was adamant that this wasn't happening in his house or to his son. He said that his belief system rebelled against the concept and the idea of reincarnation or past lives that he was taught from a very early age in the Judeo-Christian culture, that reincarnation does not exist. So there has to be a logical explanation as to what is happening with James. But Andrea was more open to the idea, so she decided to start taking James's dreams a bit more seriously and managed to convince her husband to at least help her in questioning James about his nightmares. So when James woke up, they would ask him about what happened in his dreams. James would tell them that he was in a plane and that the plane took off from a boat, but then it gets shot down and crashes they didn't talk to him about World War II or watch movies about it. Like, he's 2, why would they, talk about war with a 2-year-old? So they were completely baffled by this. They then asked him who was the pilot of the plane in the dreams, and he said James. But, they just thought he was confused and was saying his own name. So they asked him again, and he would just say, I am the pilot and my name is James. They then asked him what type of plane he was flying, and he would say a Corsair. So they looked it up, and it turns out that a Corsair is a real plane, which they didn't even know about. He would talk about how the Corsair had issues with landing, that it would sometimes veer to the left, and that the tyres went flat quite easily. So very specific things for a 2-year-old to say. They then went on to ask if he remembered where the plane took off from, and he said it took off from a boat. And they asked him if he knew the name of the boat, and he said the Natoma. And his parents were shocked because, again, he was right. They looked it up, and there really was a boat called the USS Natoma. It was an aircraft carrier that planes took off from, and it was in the Pacific Ocean during World War II. His dad, still being skeptical, figured that this just might be a coincidence, and he just got lucky with saying that name. But things get even crazier. As I said, James did a lot of drawings of planes, and whenever he drew anything that was related to piloting planes or World War II, he always signed them James 3. And no one knew why he started doing this. So one day his parents asked him why he's calling himself James 3, and he would say, because I'm the 3rd James. Another weird thing to happen is that when James would play with his toys, which obviously consist of a lot of planes, he would sometimes take the propeller off the front, because on this plane that's where the engine was. And he also gave his G.I. Joe characters names, and these names are not really very common names for the time, considering he was born in 1998. He called them Leon, Billy and Walter, which, okay, Billy, that's quite common still around that time, I think, but Leon and Walter, they're pretty old school names for a little boy to come up with, especially if you don't know anybody with those names. Because again, his parents said they had no idea where he got these names from. So Bruce asked him, why did you choose these names for your action figures? And James said, well, those were the guys that met me in heaven when I first got there. This is so crazy. So they kept pressing him for information, and they asked him, do you have any other friends or remember anyone else that you flew with? And he said Jack Larson. So a full name, not just a first name, he gave a full name. But even with all this, his father Bruce was still skeptical. His religious beliefs made it very hard for him to accept what was happening, and that reincarnation could have anything to do with it. So Bruce kind of made it his mission to try and disprove that his son was reincarnated, and to try and find a logical explanation for all these strange occurrences that were happening. So he starts to do more investigations to try and disprove all of this, but as you'll come to hear, he struggles to do that. So Bruce was part of a history book club, and one month, one of the books that he got as part of his book club was called Battle for Iwo Jima by Derek Wright. Obviously he brings this book home to read it, and one day James is sat on his dad's lap watching cartoons, and Bruce anything, he was lost for words. And this is when Bruce started to freak out, because things were getting so bizarre and he couldn't explain any of it. So he started researching, and he came across a website called the WWII Association. And this is where he found a man named Leo Pyatt, who was a radio man on an Avenger fighter plane with the VC-81 squadron. So Bruce reached out to Leo to ask him some questions, but he didn't tell him why he was asking. He didn't want to mention his son or what they'd been experiencing. So he just asked him if there were any Corsair planes on the Natoma boat, and Leo said no, there were only Wildcats and Avengers on the Natoma. Bruce then asked about the location to see if there was any accuracy with that. So he asked Leo, did you guys have any missions near Iwo Jima? And Leo said that he had been a part of 36 missions there. Bruce then asked him if he knew someone named Jack Larson, if anyone with that name was aboard the Natoma, and he said yes. Not only did Leo remember Jack, he also remembered James Houston, saying there was a Jim Houston, a rather large shell hit him in the engine and it burst into flames and went down. And that was James Houston Jr., who was the only pilot killed from the squadron at Iwo Jima. And he was born and raised in the Midwest, and his life ended when he was shot down over Chichijima, Japan. And I'm sure Bruce was absolutely mind blown at this point that this man knew Jack Larson and a man named James Houston that died off the Natoma boat in Japan by being shot down. Leo didn't know what happened to Jack Larson. He said the last time that he saw him, he had just flown off the Natoma and he never saw him again. So now the search was on for Jack Larson, but Bruce couldn't find anything on him anywhere. He searched the US National Archives and tried to find lists of anyone who had died while being stationed at the Natoma, and Jack Larson wasn't on any of these lists, and he couldn't find any record of him. In September of 2002, Bruce decided to go to a WWII Association reunion, and whilst he was there, he managed to find out that Jack Larson was a real person and that he was still alive and currently living in Springfield, Arkansas. And Bruce was like, quote, "Holy mackerel, I mean really, you could have bored my brains out of my ears," end quote. Bruce managed to get in contact with Jack Larson, and Jack explained that him and James Houston were friends and that he'd actually been his wingman that day. He said that James was struck by enemy fire, and when he didn't return, he was declared missing in action. Little boy James described being shot down, and he would say that his plane had sustained a direct hit on the engine, and when he was asked to show on a model aeroplane where it was hit, he pointed right to the front of the engine. Now, a man named Ralph Klaber, who was a rear gunner on a TBM Avenger that flew off the Natoma Bay, seems to corroborate little James's story. On March 3rd, 1945, Ralph took part in a raid near Iwo Jima, and his plane was right next to the one flown by James Houston Jr. Ralph said, "We experienced pretty heavy aircraft fire, but this was the most intense that I experienced at any time. Suddenly there was a flash into the nose of Houston's plane. I saw the hit. I would say he was hit head on, right in the middle of the engine." Just as little James had described it. So James Houston Jr. was a fighter pilot in the Pacific during James III because he really was the third James. This James Houston was junior, so he was the second James, and now if he's this new little James, he's the third. And at this point, Bruce's view of what's going on with his son starts to soften because he's just in a state of shock about how all of this information lines up with what his 2-year-old has been saying. I mean, there's only so much denial one can be in before you start to realise that my son knows things he couldn't possibly know. Bruce said my meter of skepticism was starting to go over toward belief. But the one thing that didn't add up was the Corsair, because James still insisted that he used to fly a Corsair plane. And after Bruce did some digging, he found out that the plane that James was in when he died was actually an FM-2 Wildcat fighter plane, not a Corsair. While he was at the reunion, he said no one even mentioned Corsairs and that no one could recall there being Corsair planes on the Natoma. So that was the only part that wasn't making sense. But Bruce is now really intrigued by all of this and wants to continue investigating. So he managed to track down James Houston's family, and in 2003 they made contact with his sister, Anne Houston Barron. She was living in California at the time, and when they contacted her and told her what was going on, she was obviously very surprised, but she wanted to talk to little James herself. So they ended up having several phone calls, and here are a few things that James knew that there was no way he could have known about. James told Anne that they had a sister named Ruth, which was correct. And Anne hadn't mentioned anything to do with her sister to little James. He said that Ruth was 4 years older than Anne, and that Anne was 4 years older than him, making him the youngest. Also true. He also said that he used to call her Annie, and she confirmed it. She actually said that he was the only one that ever called her Annie. At one point, Anne had sent James a picture that her mother had painted of her brother James Houston, and when little James received it, he called Annie to thank her, and he asked, "Where's the one Mum painted of you?" Anne said that there was no one else in the world except her brother and sister that knew there was an identical picture painted of her when she was the same age. James even remembered that the artist who did these paintings was named Darryl, and that they were given to his mum as a gift. Such specific details for this 2-year-old boy to know. Everyone must have just been absolutely mind blown. And Anne believes that little James is the reincarnation of her brother, saying, "The child was so convincing and coming up with all these things that there's no way in the world he could know unless there is a spiritual thing." Anne offered to send a package to James with some photos and things inside, and she included a note for his parents that read, "Dear Bruce and Andrea, all of this is still overwhelming. I can only imagine how it has affected you, but I believe. With my love to you, Anne." And in this package, there was a picture of James Houston Jr. standing in front of a Corsair aeroplane. Apparently, a Corsair was James's favourite plane, and it's what he learned to fly in, and it's what he flew in the most. So no wonder little James remembered Corsairs so prominently, because that's what James Houston spent most of his time flying in, despite the fact it wasn't on the Natoma, but the Natoma was such a small experience in comparison He was part of an elite special squadron called the VF-301 in 1944. The year before James Houston died, the elite squadron test flew Corsairs for carrier use, and only 20 pilots were selected for this assignment, James Houston being one of them. However, the VF-301 was disbanded after 8 months, and James was transferred to the VC-81. And after learning this, Bruce was sold. He said that was the one missing piece that he needed to convince him that James really did have a past life as this other James. And after talking to other veterans from the Natoma, Bruce found out that the names of Little James's G.I. Joes, Billy, Walter and Leon, were actually real people. Their full names were Billy Peeler, Leon Connor and Walter Devlin, and they all served with James Houston on the Natoma, which is just incredible. I don't know how you can refute this story, to be honest. After being so heavily involved in all of this digging and researching, Bruce decided to actually contribute to the memorial for the Natoma Bay. He created the memorial, and it was inaugurated at the Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas. And many Natoma Bay veterans came to this memorial event. At this point, James was a little bit older, so he could go to the memorial and see all these veterans, or his old friends. So he went along, and when talking to the veterans, James said to one of them, "You're Bob Greenwald." And it turns out that yes, it was indeed Bob Greenwald, and he had served with James Houston Jr. James said that he recognized Bob by his voice. After the memorial, his parents noticed that James was a bit sullen, and they asked if he was okay. And James said that he was okay, but he was a bit disappointed because they were all old. In his mind, he remembers all of his friends being young during World War II, and so it didn't occur to him that they'd all grown up and they're old men now. You know, he was expecting to see his young friends, and that's why he said that he only recognized Bob by his voice, because they all look so different. As time went on, James's parents decided to do a kind of memorial service for James Houston Jr. at the site of his plane crash. So they travelled to Chichijima, and they did a little service out on the ocean where they threw flowers into the water, and James got really, really emotional. He just broke down sobbing. But when it was over, his parents said that it was almost cathartic for him, like it was able to close a loop. And now what's also really interesting about this story is that James still believes he is the reincarnation of James Houston Jr., even though he's grown up, because usually by the brain. Rather, consciousness is everywhere, and the brain is like an antenna that picks up the consciousness frequency. And so, if that's the case, then it's very conceivable that when we die, our consciousness just rejoins the collective consciousness that's everywhere, and that maybe it can come back again. Or me and my boyfriend were talking about all these theories, and he suggested that maybe for whatever reason children are able to more easily